In this video, I'll look at the daylight system and the photographic exposure controls. We'll start out with the daylight system in this scene. We've got an outside and windows with neat frame design and an inside section to it. I'd like to have the sun stream through the windows and cast neat patterns on the floor, as well as lighting up the scene. I'll go to the render settings, and in the indirect lighting tab, making sure that render using is set to mental ray, I'll click on Physical Sun and Sky, Create. That makes the daylight system and also turns on final gathering for the bouncing and regathering of indirect light. The daylight system is controlled by the physical sky node. Into it are linked the sun direction, which shows up as a directional light, and the cameras in the scene. It also creates an exposure node on the camera, which we'll see in a minute. The first thing I do with the daylight system is to select the sun direction, make it bigger, and rotate it in the right place. Right now, if we render this, and I'll pull up IPR, as IPR and mental ray traces nicely. Right now when we render this, we get sunshine, perfectly clear day. Actually, let me rephrase that. An exactly clear day with no particulate water in the air. At 12 noon, June 21st, San Rafael, California. Autodesk's headquarters, apex or summer solstice. It's neat, but not stunning in terms of lighting, and it's the default. Nothing screams, I don't know what I'm doing, more than leaving it at the default settings. We want to stylize this in our scenes, so here's what I'll do. I'll pick the sun direction in my outliner, choosing Window, Outliner off the hotbox, and in the outliner, picking the sun direction. The sun direction is actually a directional light whose properties are all suppressed by mental ray. What controls it is actually the MIA physical sun, which in turn is controlled by the sky. I'll take this object and scroll down to the Object Display node in the Shape. In the Object Display Locator Scale, I'll make this bigger. I like my sun big so I can find it easily. Otherwise, it's very small in the scene. There's the sun. When I light with the daylight system, what I want to do is orient that sun diagonally in two views. I'll press E for rotate and swing it down one way and then the other. Which way it comes from depends on your scene. Here's what I'm looking for. In a top view, that sun is diagonally, but not at a 45-degree angle, across the scene. In a front or left view, it's the same, streaming diagonally in, not at a 45. What this gives me are long diagonal light shapes and differently lit surfaces, that adjacent surfaces that are 90 degrees apart receive different lighting in the scene, so I can tell them apart. I'll go to my camera and check it out. In the first camera, I'll hit render. Actually, in the first camera I'll use IPR. As we can see already in the final gather, and I want to encourage you to learn to read the final gather image without waiting for the full rendering, the sunlight is streaming into the space really nicely, giving me great patterns on the floor, casting the echo in beautiful light and streaming across the wall and bringing those blank expanses to life. It's a great way to go. I need to tune it a little further. The angle is pretty good. We'll deal with the softness in the sun in a minute, but I want to work on the lighting and color. I'm going to put an exposure node on the camera. I'll select my camera and right-click on the word Lens Shader in the Mental Ray section and choose Break Connection. If I were to render now, the image would blow out completely. The Lens Shader governs or tone maps the brightness from that daylight system. Into that Lens Shader node, I'll add in, under Mental Ray Lenses, the MIA Exposure Photographic. This brings film-style camera controls, such as ISO or film speed, camera shutter duration, and f-stop into the camera controls. Right now it's set for the Sunny 16 rule at an ISO of 100. What I like to do is to raise the ISO. Being this is an interior shot, I'm going to run it at 200. The camera shutter, and this number is expressed as 1 over in a fraction of a second, governs how long the shutter is open to let light in. I'm going to run a 64th of a second shutter, but I'll open up the aperture, or lower the f number. I'll try an f2 and see how that looks. So I've speeded up the film, or speeded up the sensitivity to light. I've lowered the shutter duration. It's open and closed for 1/64 of a second, which sounds fast, but it's actually comparatively slow. But I've also opened up the aperture, the amount of light coming into the lens. I'll see how this looks and proceed. What I like to do to be able to tweak an image quickly is pull up my IPR using a test resolution of maybe 50%. And work in IPR with my exposure node. I'll get it looking right through one camera and then move it over or copy it to the others. So this is good, but it's not terribly bright. Here's the things I can do. If I lower my shutter too much, I can get motion blur if I match that shutter setting in post. I can barely see things, so I need to increase the brightness in the sky. By selecting the camera up here on the toolbar under View, I can go and choose the MIA Physical Sky and increase the multiplier. Right now it's set to 1. I'll try a multiplier of 12 and see what it gets me. Better. I'm getting more light in the scene. I've definitely got light coming in, but I still need to adjust it further. I'll go back to the exposure, and I'll play with the CM2 factor, the brightness perceived. I'll try a CM2 of 5. Now I really start to see the value come back in. What I'm looking for in the image is deep shadows, bright highlights, and a lot of range between, with as little clipping or crushing as possible. I'll add a few more things into this. I'll try slowing down that camera shutter, or increasing the sensitivity of the film to light. ISO 400 is often used for outside shots, and we can see we get a brighter image. It's better. The ceiling is dark, the eco are in this soft light, maybe simulating a dawn coming in, and with a little bit lower shutter to let more light in, I can get a very good looking image that's nice and bright and nice and dark at the same time. The photographic exposure provides a terrific way to govern the image, to tone map to a particular setting, and get some really great values here. One last thing I'll do. In the exposure, I'll burn the highs just a little bit. I like to have a little extra pop in the highlights. Not so much the sky blows out completely, although we can replace it with an image or background as well. But just enough that anywhere that's shining has a little extra glare to it. I'll also leave the blacks crushed at 0.3. This takes the lower end, the shadows, and pushes them down darker. Finally, we have saturation. I'll leave the saturation at 1 for a full color image. However, sometimes I like to run things in black and white as an example, and put the saturation at 0. I also use this setting of saturation at 0 for testing lighting, looking first at value and then coming back and looking at color. I find looking at a grayscale lets me look at how well the light is coming into the scene without the confusion of what color is it. When I'm ready, I can bring the saturation back up. Here's the last part. I don't want to have multiple exposures running around my scene in multiple cameras. I'm going to take this exposure and copy and paste it to the other cameras. I'll go down to the camera shape node and select the name of that lens shader and press Ctrl-C for copy. Now I'll go to camera 2, either selecting it or going to it and using the select camera button. In that camera, I'll select and instead I'll paste in that name in the lens shader. We can see down here on the bottom, result connected, the photographic exposure message to the camera lens shader. Basically what this says is, photographic exposure, talk to the camera. And now we know it's working in both. A lot of times what I'll do for working is do the same to my perspective. So in the perspective view, if I need to test render a scene, I'm getting the same values in that camera. I'll go test it through camera 2. So we can see in camera 2 it's perhaps a little bright. I may want to tone this down or adjust the exposure for this camera. I could use a separate exposure node. It depends on how I want to see the lighting in the scene. I'm going to leave it alone because these guys will have materials on them beyond this default Lambert and may look a little different in the scene. I don't mind that he's fairly bright. I can always adjust it later. but I like how he's picked out against the background in these colors. My general workflow then is this. If I'm using daylight, or really any lighting, get a photographic exposure node on the cameras, all the cameras first. Get a setting in, and try the lighting in that. We can always adjust the settings as we need, but we want to have the true range of photographic exposure first, rather than putting it on later and having to readjust everything.